Good afternoon, dear English Without Borders followers and those who are watching us through Facebook and via Zoom. Today we are hosting Dr. John Miglietta, who will be presenting about the African American literature and poetry. So before we start the webinar, I'd like to give you some brief information about Dr. Miglietta. Dr. John Miglietta received his PhD in politics from New York University in 1995, and he's a professor of political science at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee, and his research areas are international security, American foreign policy, as well as Middle East and Central Asian politics. He has published the following books like American Alliance Policy in the Middle East, Introduction to Political Science and Anthology, Cognella Publishers, and German Alliance Politics in World War II. So John Miglietta currently is a Fulbright Fellow in Tajikistan for 2021 through 2022. So now I'd like to give the floor to Dr. John Miglietta, who will be talking about, as I said in the beginning, about African American literature and poetry. Thank you, and Dr. Miglietta, the floor is yours.
There we go. Okay, as was said, the subject of my talk is going to be African American literature, music, and the arts. Basically, February is Black History Month, where we essentially commemorate the accomplishments of African Americans to American society, politics, art, literature, music, sports, etc. So this talk is going to be focusing on literature and music primarily. American Space is doing a bunch of other presentations this month on various other aspects of Black History Month. One of the things we're going to focus on is the significance of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a literary movement in the first part of the 20th century of African American literature and dealing with various themes that we're going to focus on. Harlem is a part of New York City. It's Upper Manhattan, essentially. It is named after a city in the Netherlands. The Dutch were the first Europeans to settle what would eventually become New York. They called it New Amsterdam. And then the British eventually took it over and it became New York. The Harlem Renaissance was a period from roughly the end of World War I, so 1918, 1919, until about the mid-1930s. So it spanned the end of World War I to about the middle of the Great Depression. It was an era where many African American writers rose to the forefront, writing poetry, fiction, drama, and essays. Common themes in their work dealt with alienation, marginality, folk materials, the blues tradition. We'll talk more about blues when we talk about music, and the problems of writing for an elite audience. This period also saw the development of a heightened racial consciousness among African Americans. Now, we kind of have to go back before the start of the Harlem Renaissance to look at, African American authors and their contributions to American society. And one of the first was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in 1818. And he eventually gained his freedom, and he wrote basically autobiographies describing his experience. So some of his works, probably his best known work is Narratives of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And he became a noted abolitionist. This was the movement to ban slavery in the United States prior to the Civil War. And he also later on in life became active in the women's suffrage movement. He even ran for vice president of the United States on a small party that advocated women's voting rights. Marcus Garvey was another significant individual in this period of time, African American. He was a Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist, dedicated to promoting resettlement in Africa. He founded an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and he published the Negro World newspaper. He founded the Black Star Line shipping company to encourage Black-owned businesses and commerce. And eventually, I believe he did relocate to West Africa himself. So we were talking about Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist dedicated to promoting resettlement in Africa, and he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which published the Negro World newspaper, which was one of a number of primarily African-American newspapers being published at the time. He founded the Black Star Line shipping company to encourage Black-owned businesses and commerce, and he eventually did relocate to himself to West Africa. Pictured here are two of the giants of African-American education, Booker T. Washington on the left and W.E.B. Du Bois on the right. They were contemporaries, but they had different views about educating the African-American community. Booker T. Washington would found the Tuskegee Institute, which later became Tuskegee University, which is historically Black college and university in Tuskegee, Alabama. And he believed that it was really important for Blacks to enter the middle class. He emphasized educating African Americans in the trades, so in the industrial arts, basically, so that they would be plumbers and mechanics and electricians and things of that nature. And this way they would gain more political clout and more economic clout. W.E.B. Du Bois' view was to focus on the talented 10th. The top 10% of African Americans should be given the best education possible, and they would go to be the leading thinkers and teachers and scientists, and the community would be uplifted that way. So they were somewhat opposed to each other in the sense that they had different philosophies of education, and both tried to. W.E.B. Du Bois ended up teaching at Fisk University, which was another historically Black college and university in Nashville, and that was like considered one of the elite schools for African Americans. Booker, again, as I mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois was best known for his book, The Souls of Black Folks. And here is basically a little bit about them that I just mentioned. Famous poets of the Harlem Renaissance. Below are some of the famous poets of the Harlem Renaissance. These are only a few with some of their most famous works. Again, for the interest of time, I can't necessarily deal with every author in poetry or books or anything like that, but I'll try to hit some of the more renowned ones. I mean, I left some people off because of time, unfortunately. One of the most famous was Countee Cullen, and he wrote a book of poetry called Color, Copper Sun, Ballad of a Brown Girl. And Countee Cullen, I believe, ended up marrying W.E.B. Du Bois's daughter. So he was the son-in-law of W.E.B. Du Bois. Paul Laurence Dunbar was the first African-American to gain notoriety as a poet. He wrote the collected poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, and that was a little bit prior to the Harlem Renaissance. Claude McKay was a noted poet and novelist. He was born in Jamaica, and he, at least for a time, was a socialist, although he kind of later rejected socialism later in life. For a time, he also lived in the Soviet Union. His poetry, Harlem Shadows, was one of the first books published in the Harlem Renaissance. And again, his books deal with alienation and the marginality of the African-American community. And American Space in February is doing kind of a weekly series on the poetry of Claude McKay. Langston Hughes was a noted poet and novelist. Again, one of his most famous works is called The Weary Blues. Again, all of these authors wrote about the experiences of average African Americans, reflecting on their culture and suffering. Some famous novelists, and again, this is way too short of a list, but again, because of time, I had to basically just pick a few people to focus on. Zora Neale Hurston was one of the most famous female African-American novelists. She wrote the book called Mules and Men, a book about African-American folklore. And her most famous work is Their Eyes Were Watching God. Nikki Giovanni, who's a little bit more contemporary, in the 1960s, she was one of the more important authors of the Black arts movement. She was very strongly militant at the time, and she was labeled the poet of the Black Revolution. The 1960s were a time when many African Americans kind of wanted to rediscover their roots, became more militant in terms of demanding equal rights and a greater share of political and economic power. In the 1970s, she started writing children's literature, and her militant views were moderated somewhat. I believe right now she's a professor of literature at Virginia Tech University. James Baldwin, his works deal with sexuality, race, and class. His works parallel both the civil and the gay rights movement. This is reflected in his works such as Go Tell It on the Mountain and Giovanni's Room. Toni Morrison wrote The Bluest Eye, Song of Solomon, Sula, Tar Baby, Beloved, and Jazz. In 1987, Beloved won the Pulitzer Prize. So again, she's a bit more, like Nikki Giovanni, she's a bit more contemporary. Famous playwrights. Lorraine Hansberry was the first Black woman to have produced a play produced on Broadway. She wrote A Raisin in the Sun, which depicted the plight of a working class African American family, I believe in Chicago. And this was made into a movie starring Sidney Poitier. And again, this was at a time when there were very few movies and TV shows depicting African Americans other than sort of stock characters in like servile roles. So this was a very groundbreaking book and also a groundbreaking movie as well. August Wilson was another noted playwright who wrote a series of plays depicting life in his native Pittsburgh. One of the most famous is Fences, which was made into a movie not that long ago starring Denzel Washington. And it basically deals with a middle-aged sanitation worker sort of coming to grips with his relationship with his son and the way his life, the paths his life took because of discrimination and bigotry. Some famous musicians. Actually, there are many African-American musicians, but I'm going to focus more on people who kind of go way back, who were sort of trailblazers at the time. And one of the most famous ones is someone who's not as well known today. He should be well known. W.C. Handy. He was a trumpeter, and he was called the father of the blues. The blues is a genre of music. It's kind of very sorrowful, very moody kind of music. It kind of reflects the times for many African Americans. They had to put up with discrimination and segregation and poor economic conditions and things like that. And his most famous works was St. Louis Blues, and he was the first Black performer to be honored on a U.S. postage stamp. The next performer I'm going to focus on is Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong is a little bit more famous. People know him today. He was nicknamed Satchmo. He lived from 1901 to 1971. He was an American trumpeter and vocalist. He's most famous for his work Stardust, What a Wonderful World, When the Saints Go Marching In, and also Hello, Dolly, which I believe is the song I'm going to play for you now. He made a name for himself in New Orleans. In fact, today in New Orleans, the New Orleans airport is named the Louis Armstrong Airport. I think he lived the last few years of his life in New York City. The next performer I'm going to highlight is Duke Ellington. He was an American composer and pianist who led his world-renowned jazz orchestra from 1923 until his death in 1974. And one of his orchestra's most famous pieces was Take the A Train. The A Train is part of the New York City subway system. And in fact, it goes through Harlem. So many people in Harlem would have known the A Train, would have taken the A Train, etc. Famous female musicians. Marion Anderson was a contralto singer. She was an opera singer. She sang a variety of songs from opera to spirituals. Her career spanned 40 years from 1925 to 1965. In 1939, she was not allowed to perform in Independence Hall before an integrated audience because the Daughters of the American Revolution, who owned the hall, objected because she was African American. Through the intervention of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and others, she's able to perform at the Lincoln Memorial before an integrated audience of 75,000 with many more millions listening on radio. In 1955, she was the first African American to perform at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. And I think I have a little clip from her outdoor concert at the Lincoln Memorial. We've been talking about, we talked a little bit about Marion Anderson. We also have Billie Holiday, who was one of the noted blues singers of the time, jazz singers of her day as well. Some other famous musicians include Muddy Waters. He was an American blues guitarist and singer, played a major role in post-World War II electric blues. He is considered the father of the modern Chicago blues, and he influenced rock and roll. Many of these performers influenced later artists, and he had a very profound influence on rock and roll. The Rolling Stones took their name from one of his songs. Eric Clapton was a big fan and was influenced by his music. I believe he had a song, something called Like a Rolling Stone, and that's why the British band took their name from, essentially, because they really appreciated his music. Count Basie, he was a pianist and band leader who was very influential in American jazz. His orchestra worked with many of the prominent singers of the day. In 1958, he was the first African American to win a Grammy Award, which is the highest award for a musician. His signature songs are 1 O'Clock Jump and Blue Skies. And again, this is just a small smattering of famous African Americans who made their mark on literature and music. Again, I invite you to read on this subject. There are many, many other artists and writers that that time just prevented me from dealing with in a big way. Going to the chat, I see there's a question about, is there a big difference in the language of African-American writers and literature written by white Americans? Well, I think a lot of the African-American writers are dealing with issues of, race and marginality that for the most part, white authors and musicians aren't really dealing with, because they've never really encountered that themselves, encountered that particular bias themselves. So a lot of, particularly the literature of the Harlem Renaissance, the poetry of Claude McKay, the writings of Langston Hughes and others deal with, discrimination against, the legacy of discrimination against African Americans and the marginality of the African American communities socially, politically, and economically. So that's a very, very good question. How different is African-American literature nowadays compared to the 1960s? Again, I'm not really an expert on literature, so I don't know as much about modern literature, but I think you still see that that's a common theme among African-American literary authors. If you look at the work of the science fiction writer Octavia Butler, for example, she talks a lot in her writings, even though she's writing about sort of a futuristic sort of dystopian world, she does deal with issues of race and racial discrimination and marginality. So I think those themes are still there. They're just maybe put in a more sort of contemporary context. So again, some very, very good questions here. And again, I just implore you to read as much as possible. All literature, but particularly if you're interested, African-American literature, and look at the contrasts and comparisons between the different authors. Also remember, when you're talking about music, and you look at the musicians of today, remember the origins of that type of music and the debt that people owe to people like Muddy Waters and Count Basie and Louis Armstrong and others as well, because they helped pave the way at a time when it was not so easy for African Americans to get venues and to perform and whatnot. And they did it, and they persevered, and they ended up, as you saw with Louis Armstrong, he was playing with essentially an integrated band. Essentially, that wasn't possible maybe in the early part of the 20th century. So again, they had to put up with a lot, but they persevered. So so think about that when you're enjoying some of the music of today. When we talk about Black literature, music, and art separately, it could also be considered as how to talk about it properly during English classes. Well, I can understand the sentiment, but I think it's not so much, I think, segregation. It's just understanding where the artists are coming through. When you look at any piece of literature, whether you're looking at politics or political philosophy or history or whatever, you have to know where the artist is or the writer is coming from, and that influences how they perceive their society, how they perceive their condition. So I think looking at it in that sense makes it, I think, more meaningful to understand like what the writers or the performers were sort of going through. So again, some very, very good questions. And again, I invite you to come to American Space, and especially in the month of February, we'll be doing a number of programs detailing African American History Month, also English Without Borders, same thing. So please pay attention to the Facebook page and announcements for upcoming events. I want to thank everyone for your attention, and I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. I'm sorry if it was a little bit choppy because of my own technical inexpertise, but thank you for sticking with it. Have a great rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you at various events, either at American Space or English Without Borders. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Miglietta. So we have some questions, if you don't mind.
So, sure.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Some of our audience who are just watching us on Facebook, they have put their questions on Facebook. So one of them is asking, like, what books for children from Black writers do you suggest for non-native speakers?
Books for children. Well, I know Nikki Giovanni has written some children's literature. Probably one of the best books is not written by an African American. It's called The Snowy Day. And it was written in the 1960s. And it's just about a little child who goes out literally on a snowy day. I mean, and what he does and everything. And it happens to be an African American child. And what was unusual was this is the 1960s, and you didn't have a lot of mainstream books with African American characters. And when they asked the author, about it, he said, well, I wanted to do an urban setting, and the title character happened to be African American. I don't think he was trying to make any point or anything like that. It's just, he that's just how he did it. And that has become, the book has won all kinds of awards. It's a really good book, actually, for children and for adults as well. And I think there's a whole series of books about this character that the writer wrote. And unfortunately, his name escapes me at the moment. I know I'll think of it probably tonight. But yeah, I certainly recommend The Snowy Day. It's not by an African American. I know that, but it has an African American sort of principal character. And again, this is written in the 1960s, where you didn't have very many African American characters in books or on TV shows or in movies that weren't playing sort of like servile characters or secondary characters at best. It was just in the 1960s that
TV was starting to cast African Americans in lead roles, and other than, Maid and Gardner and things like that. So, and that was true of a lot of different groups as well. I mean, true for Asian Americans as well. Many of the first Asian Americans who broke into show business, TVs and movies, those were the parts they got offered, gardeners and house servants and things like that. And then that helped pave the way for others to take on, more starring roles and more substantive roles and more representative roles of their communities.
Okay, next question.
Oh, this is a good question. This is a very good question.
Why people all around the world, not only in the US, should celebrate Black History Month? I mean, how to explain the relevance of this celebration to Tajik students?
While, many countries may not have a Black population per se, the experience of African Americans could be very relevant to other peoples, because most countries of the world, there has been some form of discrimination in one form or another. Maybe overt, maybe not so overt, but it may not be race, it may be religion, it may be geographical location, it may be their immigration status, for example. So I think the studying sort of the African American experience can be very, very relevant. And in many ways, the American Civil Rights Movement was sort of a model, just like the Indian independence movement was a model for the American Civil Rights Movement. So these things have a way of coming full circle.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. John Miglietta, for such comprehensive presentation about African American literature, music, and also art. So we all enjoyed. And of course, the celebration of Black History Month is going on. So we are inviting the audience to visit not only American Space in Dushanbe, but also American spaces across the country where they still have some activities devoted to Black History Month. So thank you very much, dear audience, dear our speaker, and wishing all of you to have a good evening. Thank you, and please stay tuned on us and follow us on social media. We are going to have more webinars soon. See you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.